सिगड़ी में कोले डाल। वज़ीरा, तुम 4 जाने बाल्टियाँ लेकर खाए का पानी बाहर फेंको। मानसिंह, महासिंह, शाम हो गए हैं, काय के दरवाजे का पहरा बदला दो। कहते हुए सूबेदार खंडक में चक्कर लगाने लगे। वज़ीरा सिंह पलटून का विदूषक था। बाल्टी में कंदला पानी भरकर खाए के बाहर फेंकता हुआ बोला, मैं बाधा बन गया हूँ, करो जर्मनी के बादशाह का तर्पण। इस पर सब खिलखिला पड़े और उदासी के बादल फट गए। लहना सिंह ने दूसरी बाल्टी उसके हाथ में भरकर देखकर कहा, अपनी बाड़ी के खरबूजों में पानी दो, ऐसे खाद का पानी पंजाब भर नहीं मिलेगा। हाँ, देश क्या है, स्वर्ग है। मैं तो लड़ाई के बाद सरकार से 10 घूमा to read an extended portion so that you could hear the two hierarchies of language coming together, the educated, condescending way the narrator sums up Kisu Amad's situation in the village, as opposed to the colloquial manner of speech we hear in their dialogue. There are important debates about how to interpret the narrative stance of the story and how that interpretation signals something about the way we can use literature to work out political problems. I would like to suggest that such efforts to express previously marginalized experiences, even if unflattering ways, enrich the language in ways that go beyond the individual and help create a public sphere that allows later writers like Ajay Navari, if you know his work, to write a story like Yes Sir, that parodies these representations. This is how a national language should offer deep, horizontal comradeship. Just as Premchand's novels and short stories enabled readers to imagine in evocative cadences the longings and struggles of an increasingly broad range of actors in the years leading up to independence, Purneshwanath Renu's prose introduced readers beautifully, excruciatingly to the realities and rhythms of what he dubbed the Maila Anchal shortly after independence, as we see in his famous short story Tisri Kasam, Urf Mere Gaye Gulfam. Like Guleri's Usne Kahata, Renu's Tisri Kasam evokes a nostalgia for the idioms of a specific locale outside the usual gambit of upper-middle-class urban cliched Hindi. This story in particular also features oral performances, as we hear as the cart driver Hiraman starts recounting a story to his fair, a beautiful Nautanki actress. Okay, and this is the last example and the last page. सुनिए आज भी परमार नदी के महुआ कटवारों के काय पुराने घाट है इसी मुल्क की थी वहाँ थी तो कटवारन लेकिन 100 सतवंती में एक थी उसका बाप दारू ताड़ी पीकर दिन रात बेहोश पड़ा रहता उसकी सौतेली माँ सच्चात राक्षस
देखो एक बात, आपका वक्तव्य बहुत अच्छा था, बहुत ही आनंद आया, और पर मैं विशेष करके जो पहले वारसी साहब कह रहे थे, तो उन्होंने जब अपनी बात प्रारंभ की तो उन्होंने एक शब्द अनुवाद के संदर्भ में प्रयोग में लिया, कैनिबलिज्म। उससे मेरी संवेदना को बहुत आघात पहुंचा। तो फिर मैंने सोचा इन्होंने ऐसा प्रयोग क्यों किया है, तो मेरे सौभाग्य से उन्होंने उसको स्पष्ट करते हुए कहा कि कंटेंट और फॉर्म जो है अनुवादक के सामने वो मीट एंड बोन की तरह है। तो मुझे लगा मैं जहां से देख रहा हूं, शायद इसलिए क्योंकि मैं एकेडमिक सर्कल से बाहर हूं और मेरे साथ भी कुछ पुस्तकें हैं, उनमें से एक पुस्तक जो मेरी अनुदित की हुई है जिसका नाम अनंत की आहट है। इसका मूल टाइटल था द कॉल ऑफ द डिवाइन, पर जब अनुवाद करते समय आप उसके भाव को देखते हैं, उसकी आत्मा को, उर्दू में जाए तो उसकी रूह को पकड़ने का प्रयत्न करते हैं, तो वो मीट एंड बोन से परे की बात हो जाती है। और मुझे ये भी उनसे असहमति रही जब उन्होंने कहा कि ये क्रिएटिविटी है और अनुवादक उपस्थित होना अच्छी बात है उनकी दृष्टि में, और वो उससे सहमत नहीं। मुझे उसमें भी लगता है कि ये एक सूक्ष्म स्तर की यात्रा है जिसमें कंटेंट और फॉर्म के अलावा जो मुख्य भाव है, जो उसकी आत्मा है, आप उसका आह्वान कर रहे हैं, और उसका आह्वान आप विनयशीलता के साथ करेंगे तो एक पारदर्शिता रहेगी, जो मूल है वो पूरी तरह बाधित नहीं होकर आगे प्रवाहित होता रहेगा। धन्यवाद।
So, excuse me, I'm going to speak in English if that's okay. I will let Dr. Warsi defend cannibalism if he would like. I'll say a little bit about my own working with Vijayandeta, and this is very a brief summary. There are dangers on either side of disregarding the form and also losing a sense of what in the history of translation into English people have talked about word for word and sense for sense. So you want to have a sense of the spirit of the work, and you also want to pay attention to the form. When I teach translation to English speakers, so English speakers who also have another language and they translate into English, that's the only language we have in common, I give them different literal translations of a ghazal, and I give them the rules of a ghazal, and I ask them to just make sure that they follow 2 of those rules of form, and then also decide how much they want to stay close to the sense. And it gets them to realize that there's always things you're prioritizing. In certain work, it's much more important that you have a rhyme scheme, other work that you have a meter, certain things that, for example, it sounds like when Dr. Varsi was translating Premchand, he had the same experience I did, where it's very important to really convey the difference in the speakers, and find some way of doing that. I had a student when I taught at University of Virginia who translated Coffin into a West Virginia accent, and he was from West Virginia, and he said that locale made more sense to him in English to really provincialize them in a particular way, which is a way of saying that of course there's always an act of appropriation, and as a translator you're put into a difficult situation. When I started teaching, I decided that I would use translation to get people interested in learning the language. And I think that can still be something, instead of seeing them as being rivals. And I didn't sense that in what you said, but I do think that there is a way, especially my argument and my work has been that the multilingualism of India teaches a lot about how to be global citizens, and so the ways that we think about translation and between Hindi, English, and other languages is also a very nice model, and for us to really see ourselves as being in a position to offer some kind of, I don't know, an ethical alternative to that kind of monoculturalism and monolingualism. Do you want to say something about the cannibalism?
I think you already answered my questions. Like my sense was form and content is always translator has the choice of words, like the poet has the choice of words, like you have Baal, Gesu, Zulf. It doesn't matter what they would like to go for, what suits best for the audience. So it was simply the choice of words. I used that as a translator. Universal, that is a very challenging field, and it's entirely a different world that you are associated with. How to translate the feeling, emotions from one person to another person. How I can translate, it's a very difficult job. So we have to take the things how close we can be. We cannot say I cannot say my translation is perfect. Nothing is perfect. We have the choices. Last night I was watching on the CNN. There was an ad about a show, Finding Jesus of Gospel of Judaism, and there was a scholar, biblical scholar. They came out with the actual Coptic language translation of a word that changed the entire dynamics of the things. So you may have seen, and still is going on. So you may look at how translation is difficult. One has to be careful about translating the feeling and emotions from one language to another language. That's what I say. Thank you so much.
डॉक्टर मेहता कुछ कहना है बताइए आप तो जी डॉक्टर मेरे प्लीज जस्ट आपका प्रश्न किसके लिए है डॉक्टर मेरे ओके
I think both the speakers spoke about translating short stories and the novels from Hindi to English language. I will like your experience, difficulties, and if there is anything that we can go for, translating the Hindi poetry into the English, because that creates a completely different challenge. Translating the novels and stories may be simpler. It does have, you have to take into account the cultural aspect as well as the language, metaphors, etc. But translating the poetry into another language, can you tell me your experience and if there is any kind of academic work going on in this field?
So I can start with my personal experience. I don't know if any of you have read the poetry of Mangalesh Dabral. So he's a personal friend. He was at Iowa when I was there. He was on the International Writing Program. And so I started trying to translate his poetry, even though I myself am comfortable translating poetry, not primarily because it's hard in and of itself, but because I don't know the tradition in English as well. So to translate well, you not only have to have skills in the language, each of the languages, but you have to have a very keen sense of the tradition that you're translating into and what kind of experiments are going on in the language you're translating from. So we would spend hours together. I recently contributed to a volume he published that, so a year ago at the World Book Fair, I think they call it, in Delhi. It had we had a publication party, and we spent so much time working together on that. There are people, so often he would look at my first draft, and he'd say, his line would be half the page and mine would go over onto the next line, and he'd say, can you make this shorter? Go ahead, such shorter way. And sometimes I'd come up with something, he'd say, oh, that's not it at all. And then sometimes he'd say, oh, that's it. That's better than the Hindi, which I don't think is true, but I think it's fun. Vijayandatha used to do that too. He would delight in seeing a new version, and that's part of the creativity that I think Dr. Warsi was talking about. There is much work going on thinking about translation of poetry and looking at specific formal experiments, the different traditions. If there are certain things that are considered, say, there was in the 80s in America, there was a return to formal poetry like Villanelle's, and that still is seen as being very old-fashioned, and it looked very funny translating some of that into Hindi in a way that was using formal features. It didn't see cutting edge. So that's just one example of the way you have to kind of gear what's going on in the source language text to what's going on in the target language text, language you're translating to.
बहुत ही स्वागत है आप सबको प्रश्नों का, लेकिन थोड़ी सी मुश्किल ये है कि हम लोग बहुत देर हो चुके हैं और अगला सत्र प्रारंभ होने वाला है। लेकिन अगर एक प्रश्न हो और बहुत ही संक्षिप्त प्रश्न हो, टू द पॉइंट हो, तो ज़्यादा अच्छा रहेगा। तो मैं बीच में आना नहीं चाहता, लेकिन
Very short answer is yes. I have read, I do think, yes. And when I started translating Vijayanandetha's work, I was interested. He was published in Manushi, if you remember, first in Hindi and then translations in English. And I was very intrigued at this idea of a traditional male patriarchal man from Rajasthan being seen as a feminist writer. And I've been thinking about what feminism is in one tradition and how even the idea of feminism translates. So it's very similar to the question about formal verse and how you translate that there are different feminisms, including within languages and regions in India. And I think that would be a fascinating book. I would love to have a student who wants to work on that, because it's something that kind of is ancillary to the work that I'm doing and requires full-on dedication to that. Wonderful topic.
Hi, this is Deepak Davi from Bharatiya Vidya. I just wanted to ask you one question. Have you ever tried to do the translation in terms of dubbing of film from Hindi to English or English to Hindi? Because that lip-syncing part with the language is a wonderful exercise. And has it been introduced anywhere in the colleges, or have you tried that section? Because that is easiest but still the hardest way to go about.
So I'll say personally, this may not seem like a very good answer. It may not make sense at first, but my father was an opera singer and dragged me to every rehearsal, every dress rehearsal. And when I was studying Hindi, I could never hear lyrics. And it seemed related to my father being a singer. But I know at Michigan, there are some courses being taught in dubbing and subtitling, and they're very popular. And that's part of, I'm part of a translation initiative. That was the point of your question?
Yeah. Subtitles are a separate thing. That's the gist of it.
But you have to get it in the box in a certain amount of seconds.
Whatever you're speaking in English, if I am dubbing in Hindi, and making sure that it is you who is speaking Hindi, that is an art of writing Hindi.
That is.
Or else writing in English from Hindi.
Yeah, and we consider that part, at least at Michigan, we consider that one of the practices of translation. And they're very interesting. One of my colleagues has written a book called Cinema Babble that looks at both the dubbing and the subtitling and thinks about the sort of ongoing wars about whether you prefer one or the other, but they both have very interesting
difference of grammar, English and Hindi. Why will say?
तो शायद हम विषयांतर कर रहे हैं, क्षमा कीजिएगा दीपक भाई, क्योंकि क्रिस्टी भी रहेंगी यहाँ पे, मतलब भोजन तक तो आप नहीं कम से कम, तो जो साथ के दूसरे विषय हैं या अनुवाद का या फिल्म साहित्य का तो कर सकते हैं। 10:30 बजने वाला है और हमें कोशिश ये करनी चाहिए कि अगला सत्र हम प्रारंभ करें, उसका भी महत्व है। लेकिन शायद एक प्रश्न, अंतिम प्रश्न आप पूछ लीजिए, अपना परिचय देते हुए।
Just very briefly, it was such a great talk, and I just wanted to say more about how Marathi literature came into Mexic's work. If you could say something about that, and also relatedly, I was just curious if you thought that Dalit literature has the potential to actually open up this sort of multilingual space that you're talking about more than other literatures, specifically because it's a more national movement, both politically and in terms of literature.
So my friend and colleague Laura Brooke has written about this, and she really thinks that I mean, that's her first book. She looks at the movement in Hindi and says that she really thinks that this is doing something really new and innovative. I'm still looking at all the documents and things. I'm still kind of in the midst of the research with the Marathi material. I'm really interested. I actually went to India. Part of my research was looking at translations of African American slave narratives, and they get quoted all the time by different Dalit writers. So I'm thinking in new ways about translation. One of my colleagues at Michigan, Manan Desai, is looking at these translations into Marathi. And so I was looking very specifically to see if they were translated into Hindi. So one answer to your question is that Hindi writers are reading them in Marathi translation or in English translation, and then quoting them and translating, kind of paraphrasing where it's necessary to talk about this as a model for their own movement. So I'm using it to think in kind of new ways about how we look at translation. I forget the second part of your question was. Oh, okay. So yeah.
निष्कर्ष ये निकाल सकते हैं कि हिंदी साहित्य और हिंदी भाषा में समर्थ है कि वो समाज के सभी तबकों के स्वरों को प्रतिनिधित्व कर सकती है, और ये संदेश इस सम्मेलन के माध्यम से भारत तक पहुंचेगा, ऐसा विश्वास है। और इसी को हम आगे बढ़ाते हुए उम्मीद करते हैं कि हिंदी एक विश्व की समर्थ भाषा के रूप में उभर कर सामने आएगी। आपका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। ये सम्मेलन हम सबका है, और मैं आप लोगों से कुछ अनुमति चाहता हूं, क्योंकि हिंदी केंद्र की स्थापना के साथ में जो भावना है हमारे कौंसलाधीश श्री ज्ञानेश्वर मूले जी का, वो बहुत ही गहरा है। और उन्होंने ये वादा किया था कि इस सत्र की अध्यक्षता करेंगे, लेकिन अभी तक पहुँचे नहीं हैं। तो मैंने उनके प्रतिनिधि श्री शंभू जी से ये पूछा, तो क्या शंभू जी अगर 1 घंटे बाद आने की संभावना है उनकी? तो अगर आपकी अनुमति हो तो जो तीसरा सत्र है उसको हम अभी पूरा करें, जो कि इनोवेटिव अप्रोचेस इन हिंदी लर्निंग। तो 1 घंटे का वह सत्र है नहीं? अच्छा, तो क्योंकि उनकी उपस्थिति होगी तो ज़रा अच्छा रहेगा। आप लोगों का अगर इसमें कोई जी, हाँ, और ये भी हो सकता